In the war between New Genesis and Apocalypse, Mr. Miracle struggles to find the reason for his involvement in the war. Is he just a pawn in the machinations between two gods? Or will he find his own way and truth in this new world? This question and others are pondered in this installment of Mr. Miracle Issue 2 Review. Mr. Miracle Issue number 2, no title, is received a score of 9.2 from critics and 9.0 on Comic Book Roundup, which is sterling score. And what really amazes me is that the critic and user scores were so much in sync. Usually on Comic Book Roundup there's a discrepancy between the two, but here they're almost the same. Plot summary, courtesy of Comic Book Roundup. What do you do after the most death-defying act of your escape artist career? You go to war, of course. Scott Free has skipped out on his trip to the great beyond and taken a boom tube to New Genesis instead, where he and his wife, Big Barda, take on the invading hordes of Apocalypse. Things are a little off, however, and Mr. Miracle starts to doubt why he's fighting when Orion takes over the mantle of Highfather. It's enough to make a new god miss Granny Goodness's orphanage. First, I want to begin by talking about the writing in the issue, and the first thing to discuss is Tom King's use of the 9-grid panel. He is one of the few, I think maybe the only one to be using it right now. I can't think of anyone else who's using it. And I watched the interview with him this last week. He talked about the different kinds of grids you can use as a writer. Carl Barks used an 8-panel grid. Early Marvel comics used a 6-panel grid. And he said he first got into it because it was a good way for him to help beginning artists. If he lays out the panel for them, the panel grid, then the artist, if they're new, and specifically this was for Omega Men, the artist for that was one of their first main titles, that if he lays out the panels for them, then the new artist, only has to focus on executing the art. They don't have to worry about the storytelling. And that from there it grew organically. And in many ways, in Mr. Miracle and in a couple of the stories before, I'm thinking of The Vision and also Omega Men, you see how Tom King has learned from Alan Moore. And he apes the style of Alan Moore. And we see that a little here, but the one thing that really differentiates him from Alan Moore is the humor. And where Alan Moore, if he used a panel where there were no words and nothing was expressed, that would be the point. That would be a point in itself. Like you think of Watchmen. Every panel is jammed with details. Here, Tom King will use a panel just to express a very minute moment, and he uses the repetition of one minute moment after another to build to comic effect. I have the page 17. There you go. Took a while for autofocus to kick in. Let's see if we get it closer. Okay, so you see the 9-panel grid there, and panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, panel 4, panel 5, nothing doing, it's the same. Panel 6, you get a little hint of a smile from Granny Goodness. And panel 7 and 8, we get a little bit of development, and then panel 9 is the payoff, the joke. We see that again and again in the issues. That I'm going to assume that not everyone watching this review is a regular comic book reader, so not everyone, I'm assuming not everyone who's watching this has read Understanding Comics from Scott McCloud. It's an influential book about the grammar of comic books that came out in the mid-1990s, maybe late 1990s, late 1990s. I want to say 1990s, 1980s. I want to say 1988. Scott McCloud said that the meaning of comics comes not in the panels, but what happens between the panels. As an example, he has in the comic is a man holding a pen in one panel, and he's ready to strike someone. And then in the second panel, you get a shriek, an onomatopoeic word of like, yell, or bam. And Scott McCloud said that our imagination fills in what happens between those two panels. So the magic of comic books happens between panel 1 and panel 2. The artist is just setting it up, and your imagination is finishing it. And what Tom King does here is redundancy. He will give you 5 panels of the same action, just 1 second later. So he's leaving no room for your imagination. And by doing this, he's making it absurd. It becomes funny because it's just beat again, beat again, beat again, beat again, beat again, beat again, beat, payoff. It's like what Letterman said, the saw of comedy. If you do something once, it's not funny. If you do something twice, it's not funny. If you do it 3 times, it's funny. If you do it 8 or 9 times, it's even funnier. So that's kind of what Tom King, one of Tom King's methods is here, is to use panels to make absurd a lot of the mannerisms that characters are doing. And then another key theme in the issue for Tom King is paranoia. We get it both about reality. So when Mr. Miracle's in the shower and he doesn't see any water, and he asks the mother box, "Can you turn on the water?" And the mother box says, "Water's already on." But we can see there is no water. We see that reality is a little bit wrong. And another theme is that of, I don't want to say friendship, we could say family, we could say association, but relationships, are they as genuine as you think? Because here we see that Granny Goodness implies that Orion has betrayed Mr. Miracle. And everything we felt about Granny Goodness, who's supposed to be the one of the villains of the piece, is upended if we believe what she's saying is accurate. But we can't believe, we can believe very, very little in this reality that Mr. Miracle seems to find himself in. And then, so that's paranoia. Paranoia on 2 levels, reality and people around you. And then the second great theme of the issue is that of abuse, because both Scott and Barda were abused and tortured by Granny Goodness, but Scott feels that Granny Goodness may actually still care for him. And here we get a universal theme from a very specific use in the comic book, because the issue of abuse and the abused loving their abuser extends beyond just this story. And so by showing us this bad relationship, this sadistic and masochistic relationship, Tom King is inviting us, the reader, to find parallels to other relationships that are like that, not just between gods, not just in the context of this comic book story. Now to discuss the art. I want to show page 7 because the use of color is outstanding in that page. And look at the colors, all the shades of red. So in this panel, we can see that Mitch Gerads, he's using one color with a couple of offsets. There you see some grays and purples. And he's washed out the background completely. All we're getting is just the red. And it's a way of emphasizing the conflict that's going on in the story at that point. And on an aesthetic level, it's just beautiful to look at. It's dirty and beautiful at the same point. And Mitch Gerads has said that for him, the challenge of working in digital, because he doesn't use pencil and ink like many artists do, he draws it straight to a computer, which allows him to color and ink his own work. The challenge is to take these clean lines that the computer gives and make them a little dirty. And you can see that a little bit here. Check out the stress lines in the back. He's using those stress lines to make the panel a little unclean so that it doesn't look so perfect the way that a computer always make it. And here we see the oranges and the reds, and then a purple is an offset color. Wonderful art. Second thing I want to point out about the art is the way that Mitch Gerads composes the frame to give the viewer a sense of height. And I think I had mentioned before Dave Gibbons. I had seen him at the San Diego Comic-Con one year, and he talked about one way to emphasize something being very tall is to put it in a frame or a shot with something very small, and that the opposition between the two, something tall appears taller when you put it next to something small. And so the way you compose the frame can convey the meaning of an object to the viewer. And here, because there's such a discrepancy in height between Barda and Mr. Miracle, you can see that to show that difference in the height, he puts Barda almost popping out of the frame. See how she's near the top of the panel there? And then to emphasize the diminutive, the short stature of Mr. Miracle, in this panel, he puts him near the bottom. So that when your eye sees those two, your mind subconsciously scans it as Mr. Miracle short and Big Barda is tall. And it's a masterful use of composition to express meaning. The last thing I wanted to mention about the art was the way that in this issue Mitch Gerads handles violence, the depiction of violence. And because Tom King spends some time complicating the reader's relationship with Granny Goodness and making it appear that she's been acting in a good way, she's not purely acting as a force of malignancy, because he has done that, rather, when we get to her death, rather than showing it graphically so that the reader can feel some sort of release in her death, catharsis, instead he abstracts her death. And so you see here, we do get the very moment of her death. You see the fatal blow, but then after that, he abstracts, and you can't really see what's going on in this panel. It's just a little fragment of what's happening, little flare from the light source, and then here we see the final act in silhouette, so that we are drawn away from the violence, and that's something that a writer will do, so that the reader will feel more distant from the violence. Give them more of an opportunity to reflect upon what's happening rather than just simply reveling in that violence. And the last thing I want to do is do a little bit of biography. I'm cognizant that there may be some people who are watching this who are not as familiar with the comic book characters, so I thought it would be helpful to them to do a little bit of a biography of a couple characters each review. So for this one, I wanted to cover Oberon. I should have done it last issue, but it didn't occur to me at that point. So because it occurred to me later, we'll do two. I'm going to try to do one each episode review, but for this episode we'll do two. The first one being Oberon. To begin with, the name Oberon comes from the King of the Fairies. The character is created by Jack Kirby, and it first appeared in Mr. Miracle, Volume 1, Issue Number 1. Let me get my shirt there. Oberon, backstory of Oberon, he was an orphan who became the assistant to the original Mr. Miracle, Theodis Brown. After Brown was killed, Oberon became assistant to Scott Free, who assumed the mantle of Mr. Miracle. And the second character is Granny Goodness. Granny Goodness was created by Jack Kirby and first appeared in Mr. Miracle Volume 1, Number 2. Her appearance is modeled after Phyllis Diller, not her actions. And the character Granny Goodness grew up on Apocalypse. And Apocalypse is, now I'm assuming this is for people who don't know anything about the Fourth World. Apocalypse is kind of close to Jack Kirby's version of Hades or Hell. And it's where Granny Goodness was separated from parents and raised to be one of Darkseid's hounds. The hounds were the crack soldiers of Darkseid. However, she distinguished herself in the hounds, and so Darkseid promoted her to the role of trainer of the hounds. She also runs the orphanages on Apocalypse and is the chief of the female Furies. And that's all for this review of issue 2 of Mr. Miracle. I hope that life finds you well and that you'll join me again soon. Take care and be well.